Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Case Western Reserve University for our Power of Diversity lecture series. And I'm very excited about today's edition of that series. And we're delighted that some of you are able to be here in person. Isn't that nice? And welcome also those of you online. For the past 11 years, the Power of Diversity lecture series has, I believe, truly inspired campus dialogue, community engagement, and civic education about the national narrative about diversity and inclusion. And we have been fortunate enough to have a series of distinguished speakers from around the world, as well as scholars from our own faculty. And today's lecture is no exception to that rule. Our past speakers have included Donna Brazil, Ray Soares, Mae Jamison, who is a chemical engineer, by the way, Eric Liu, and Julianne Malveaux. And today we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries, Associate Professor of History at The Ohio State University, and we're delighted that he can join us to present Making Sense of the Moment, Race, Politics, and Democracy. Dr. Jeffries, thank you for being here. And I know I desperately need help in making sense of what's going on in our country, so I look forward to your lecture. Now, all of us here today, I am sure, share the same belief about diversity and inclusion, and that formula is simple. There isn't one that does not include diversity. And that's true at Case Western Reserve, in this country, and this planet. Diversity is an imperative. At this institution, we aspire to be inclusive, diverse, and be a welcoming community. We want to be, and we will be, better. Guiding our way is the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. Under its leadership, Case Western Reserve has received the Higher Education Excellence in Diversity Award from Insight into Diversity magazine for 10 years in a row. This national honor recognizes American colleges and universities that demonstrate an outstanding commitment to diversity and inclusion. Also, importantly, this academic year, we welcomed our first cohort of North Star Scholars as part of our North Star Consortium, which includes 9 minority-serving institutions around the country. The program offers students new and expanded pathways to our graduate and professional school programs. Last fall, I'm proud that we enrolled our most diverse and competitive undergraduate class in the university's history. During the last calendar year, nearly 3,400 members of our faculty and staff took advantage of some sort of DEI training. And finally, every new student who joins our university community participates in a Diversity 360 program, which is our campus-wide diversity education effort. So, yes, we are making progress, and our efforts are making a difference, yet we still have much work to do. Leading our efforts in this space is Robert Solomon, our Vice President for the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity. Rob joined Case Western Reserve in 2020. Prior to that, he was the Assistant Vice Provost at The Ohio State University's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I think he's been an absolutely phenomenal addition to our university, and he's a great asset to our leadership team. He plays a critical role in guiding us to become the university community we want to be. So, Rob, thank you for your important work, and please come up and introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, President Kaler, for your great leadership, friendship, and unwavering commitment to inclusive excellence. Greetings, everyone. As President Kaler indicated, I'm Robert Solomon. I serve as Vice President for the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity here at Case Western Reserve University. The Power of Diversity lecture series today in particular is part of highlighting Black History Month, which is certainly a rich legacy that this institution has been able to be a part of for many, many years. And we have a rich legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. On February 12th, 1926, Black History Week was established to recall and celebrate the positive contributions to our nation, made by people of African descent, by African American historian Carter G. Woodson. For many years, we've set aside the second week of February for this celebration, coinciding with the birthday of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who also had a presence on this campus in 1856. In 1976, this week was expanded to Black History Month. But even with a month-long celebration, there's barely enough time to cover so many important historical events and accomplishments and life stories. So Black History Month is really a reminder that this important part of our American heritage belongs in the forefront of our consciousness 365 days a year. So the adage is true that Black History Month starts on January 1st and ends on December 31st. So it's really fitting that our National Power of Diversity lecturer is a renowned historian in the spirit of the great Dr. Carter G. Woodson, in recognition of Black History Month as well. So it's my distinct pleasure and certainly privilege to introduce Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries, a brilliant scholar and a dear friend I've known for many years. So this is doubly special. I'll tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Jeffries is an associate professor at The Ohio State University, a professor in history, where he teaches courses on civil rights and the Black Power movement. Hasan was born in Brooklyn, New York, and graduated summa cum laude from Morehouse College with a BA in history. And at Morehouse, he was initiated into the Pi chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. He earned his PhD in American history from Duke University in 2002. He taught for a year at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa before joining the faculty at The Ohio State University in 2003. Hasan is the author of Bloody Lounds, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, which tells the remarkable story of the African American freedom movement in Lowndes County, Alabama, the birthplace of Black Power. He is also the editor of Understanding and Teaching Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Movement, a collection of essays by leading civil rights scholars and teachers that explores how to teach the civil rights movement accurately and effectively. His current book project, which I'm anxiously awaiting, In the Shadow of Civil Rights, examines the Black experience in New York City from 1977 to 1993. It connects key political and cultural events, such as the youth rebellion in the South Bronx, to the evolution and implementation of public policies that changed Black communities forever, such as those that undergird the war on drugs. The book aims to provide a new narrative of the Black experience in the post-civil rights era. Hasan has worked on several public history projects from 2010 to 2014. He was the head historian and primary scriptwriter for the $27 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, the site of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He hosts podcasts, Teaching Hard History, a production of the Southern Poverty Law Center's educational division, Teaching Tolerance. And he regularly shares his knowledge of African American history and contemporary Black politics with the public through lectures, workshops, op-eds, and radio and television interviews. He has also contributed to several documentary film projects as a feature on-camera scholar, including the Emmy-nominated 4-hour PBS documentary, Black America Since MLK. It is truly a pleasure to have him with us. I'm so glad that he answers my emails and calls and I don't have to go through your agency. He has given us a great deal to come here, and we're delighted to hear from you. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries.
Thank you very much, Brother Solomon, for the warm words of introduction. And for those who are curious, my agency consists of my 3 daughters, who are 12, 9, and 6. And the 6-year-old is actually the one who runs it. But it is really an honor and a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. President Kaler, thank you very much for your attendance, for helping to make this opportunity happen. It was really something to hear the roll call of folk who have preceded me for this distinguished lecture. So it is really an honor to share this moment with you all today. I'm just going to dive right in and share some thoughts and ideas on this topic, on this issue, making sense of the moment, race, politics, and democracy. January 6, 2021. I, like most of us here, perhaps was watching television, was watching things unfold, events unfold. And as they began to unfold, I shared in the shock of the nation to see an attempt through the use of violence and force to stop the peaceful transfer of power. Shocked. We had never seen anything like this before in the history of the United States. And as the situation evolved, as it became more dangerous, as it became more violent, as it was clear that this was a situation in which people's lives were in danger, I became particularly worried because my brother is a sitting congressperson, and I was not able to reach him. And as word filtered through the news channels that there was possibly violence within the House chamber, and I knew that's where he was, and I called my parents, and they hadn't heard from him, and I called my sister-in-law, and no one was able to reach him, and this had gone on for several hours until finally I received a message not from him, but from a friend who said they heard another congressperson say that they were with my brother in some secret chamber and that everything was okay. And I said, well, I need to know about these secret chambers next time. So at that moment, I was a little bit relieved. This is about 5 o'clock in the evening now. The House, the chamber, Capitol Hill had sort of been secured at this moment. And I had to get back to the business of the day, still trying to process what happened, but I had to get back to the business of the day. And the business of the day, in fact, included committee work for the university, for Ohio State University. I had an athletic committee meeting, AD TJ Shelton, and we had to jump on the Zoom. And as soon as I jumped on the Zoom and I'm getting myself settled for this meeting, still processing everything that happened, my phone rang. Text message came through. And I pick up my phone and I look at the text message. It's from a number I do not recognize, but it's from a 614 area code. And the text message says, "You need to talk to your brother. We are armed and we are near your home. If you don't tell your brother to stand down, then we will resort to whatever means we need to resort to stop him and to stop you." Another text message came through right after that had a picture of a home in my neighborhood. It was clear that it was my neighborhood. A few minutes later, another text message came through with some more threatening language. And I sit back, got out of my meeting, sat back, and said, okay, This is, given all that's happened that morning, I can't just brush this aside, especially since it's coming from a Columbus area code. I have to take this seriously. And I had talked to my brother before about situations like this. He receives death threats all the time. It comes with the nature of the job in this moment in time. I usually don't get the death threats. I just get the crazy Twitter direct messages. So this was an escalation, but I said I have to take it seriously. People just stormed the Capitol. And so immediately I knew, since we had talked about this before, first thing I have to do is I got to call the local police, try to explain the situation. They said, okay, we'll send out a patrol car. But then I said I knew I had to call my brother. And I sent him a text message. He got right back to me. And he said, okay, there's a protocol that we have to follow. And so he put me in touch with his chief of staff. Chief of staff then relayed. I had to send the information to her. And by that time, my wife had received a series of text messages as well. So this thing began to escalate. And they said, okay, part of the protocols, we're going to reach out to the FBI, the special liaisons out of the Southern District of New York that handle these situations. I said, all right. So later that evening, after I had to get my family out of the house, pack up my girls, try to explain to my 3 girls what was happening. They knew what was happening on TV. I said, now this has gotten personal. Aside from the safety of your uncle, we got to go get them out of the house. And so now I'm on the phone talking to the FBI, special agent in charge. Well, sir, what's going on? And I relayed the information. He said, okay. He said, we'll be back in touch. All right. Later that evening, local police come by. Next morning, FBI reached back out. Local congresswoman reaches out to me and says, Hasan, have you talked to the folk at Ohio State yet? They need to know. And I said, no, I haven't called them yet. And she said, don't worry, we already talked to them. And I said, all right, thank you very much. She said, well, have you talked to the Franklin County Sheriff's Department? We have a special relationship with them when it comes to these issues. And I said, no, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty. I said, I haven't talked to them yet. She said, don't worry, we already have. I said, okay, very good. 2 days later, I got the FBI on speed dial. I got Ohio State's chief of police calling, checking up, asking if I need a patrol car stationed outside of my house 24 hours a day. There was a safety bubble that was enveloping me. Within a week, I was walking outside one day, and I brought my girls back after the weekend. Still don't know if this is who was sending these messages. But the special agent in charge, I asked him, I said, you gonna catch this guy? He's like, oh yeah, supreme confidence. He said, oh yeah. He said, no, we'll get him. I was like, really, just like that? He said, oh yeah. I was like, well, heck, I didn't know, you roll like that. I was like, okay, very good. I'm feeling kind of comfortable now. But then I walk outside one day to get the mail, and here comes the local police riding by. I look at the police looks at me, and he waves. Like, hey, Dr. Jeffries. Well, I wave back, give him the thumbs up, and he rides on by. And at that moment, I had an epiphany. I said, must be what it's like to be white in America, where the police are happy, and I'm happy. We're seeing them. They're rolling by. I'm waving at them. They're waving at me. I said, no wonder they don't want to change anything. Like, this is comfortable. This is real nice. Within 3 weeks, they captured a guy. They identified a guy. I get a call from special agent in charge on speed dial. We're best friends now. And he says, I just want to give you a heads up that, we're about to make an announcement. It's going to hit the press. And they may reach out to you. And I said, well, wonderful. I had talked to my brother before, and I said, if they do wind up capturing or catching these people, I have no desire to speak to the press about it. You can go ahead and handle that. And he said, yeah. He said, no, we're not going to do any press. And so it comes out. They arrest the fella, charge him, bring him from California, bring him down to New York. And New York Times that afternoon releases a report, an article on the incident, naming myself and my brother. And, I said, reach out to my brother again. I said, hey, it's in the New York Times. I said, I have no desire. He said, yeah, we're not talking to the press. And I was like, all right, that's cool. Like, no problem, man. And so I go about my business. And then that evening, I get a text message from one of my friends from college. And he says, Hasan, is everything all right? I say, yeah, everything's okay. He said, because I just saw your brother on MSNBC. And I said, what happened to standing down, not talking to the press? So he's on MSNBC explaining what happened. But then, all of a sudden, my phone starts to blow up. Not with the messages of hate from other folk, but from my good buddies, my friends from college, my fraternity brothers. Now even some brothers from back in the day in New York. Now these are guys who are doctors and lawyers and CEOs of tech companies. And every single one of them said, Hasan, what do you need? Whatever you need. If you need us to come there, we got your back. And you need us to go to DC and protect your brother, we got your back. And every single one of them said, after we got your back, they said, because we're armed. All of them. And I said, when did I miss the meeting where all these black people got guns? Every single one of them. So much so that I had to create a message group in my phone, Cats with Gats, because every single one of them. But it spoke to the seriousness of the situation. And I said, no, it's under control. They arrested the guy. It's just one person. It's not a group. But they understood that we were in a particular moment where this wasn't just about the personal safety of myself and my family and my brother. We were actually talking about the fate of the democracy, the fate of the nation. And they understood that. And they were willing to go to battle for it. The question then became, as I began to try to process this, like not only the personal aspect of it, but what had happened on January 6th, is how did this go down? What was the motivation for it? And how do we make sense of it? And that has everything to do with the former president of the United States refusing to accept the outcome of the November election, setting up that the election was somehow illegitimate, that the election was stolen even before all of the ballots had even been cast, let alone counted. But that in and of itself, just saying that, hey, this was an unfair election, should not have been enough to unleash a mob on the nation's capital. The key, though, is not just that he said the election was fraudulent. What made it believable in the minds of those who were conditioned to believe it is that he said the election was illegitimate, the election was stolen in particular communities. It was stolen in Atlanta, Georgia. It was stolen in Philadelphia. It was stolen in Milwaukee. It was stolen in Detroit. It was stolen where black people cast ballots. And in the minds of those who were most animated by the former president's appeals to racism, this made sense to them. This made sense to them. That any election in which black folk were the deciding votes was inherently illegitimate, was susceptible to fraud, and could not be trusted. And therefore, they were within their rights to do whatever it took to prevent this transfer of power. 1 year later, just a few months ago, the current president had something to say in very strong terms about January 6th. And he talked a little bit about history. But he didn't talk about the history that he really should have. In 1873, in Louisiana, in Grant Parish, in the parish seat of Colfax, Louisiana was one of 3 states that was still under a Reconstruction government. It hadn't been reclaimed by former Confederates, by the Democratic Party, former enslavers, former white Southerners. It was still controlled by a coalition of white Republicans and black Republicans. And there's an election, and this coalition of black votes and white elected officials retains power at the state level as well as at the parish level. And the white residents of Colfax, the white residents of Grant Parish, refused to accept this. This is 3 years after the 15th Amendment had been ratified, granting the vote to African American men. And they refused to accept that African Americans not only had a right to vote, but should vote, but could vote. They refused to accept it. So they announced that they're forming a racial terror group, the White League. This is 5 years after the Ku Klux Klan had been formed in Pulaski, Tennessee. And they said, we're going to form our own terror group. And we are going to march on the parish courthouse. And we are going to run out of office those elected officials, that coalition of black and white Republicans. A public announcement that this is what they're going to do. A group of African American men, former Union soldiers, when they receive word that this is the plan of this white group, they say that they're not going to let that happen. They are not going to let these terrorists march on that county courthouse and oust and overthrow that government. And so they grab their weapons and they go to the parish courthouse and they take up defensive positions, not only to defend those elected officials, duly elected officials, but also to defend democracy. And not long after they arrive, that group of terrorists show up. Their numbers added to by members of the broader white community. And they show up armed, including bringing a Confederate issue cannon. And it's not long after they arrive that they open fire on those black men who were defending that government. There is an exchange of gunfire. 3 of the white men are killed. Several of the African American men are wounded and killed as well. It becomes quite clear to those former black soldiers that the only way that they are going to survive is if they surrender. And so they do. They come out of their defensive positions, they walk out of the parish courthouse, and when they surrender, when they stack their arms, when they lay down their weapons, every single one of them is shot and killed on the spot. Every single one. And those who had been wounded in that initial exchange of gunfire, they are dragged out of the parish courthouse, and every single one of them is hanged. This is the Colfax massacre. The use of political violence because they did not believe that those folk who had been elected to office legitimately deserved to be there. We could have been and should have been shocked on January 6th, but we should not have been surprised because there is a long history of political violence in America designed not to extend democracy, but designed to contract democracy. And it's not just Colfax. This isn't a one-off thing. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. Tulsa, Oklahoma, focusing on an African-American business community, but also to send the message that black folk are not allowed to participate in the political process. But heck, America was born of political violence. That's what the American Revolution was. But that's not what we talk about. And that's not what President Biden was talking about. Why? Because we have constructed a myth. We have constructed a narrative so we don't have to confront this hard history. We don't have to confront this difficult history. We don't have to confront those aspects of our past that make us uncomfortable in the present, that usually revolve around issues and questions of race and racism. Some 75 years after the Colfax massacre, the state of Louisiana erects a monument, a historic marker, at the site of the incident at the site of the marker. And I'm just going to read it for you real quick. It's just 32 words. Colfax riot. On this site occurred the Colfax riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. In those 30-some words, we see summed up our typical response to hard history. Our typical response to hard history. We do one of 3 things. First, we create false narratives. We just make stuff up, calling this a riot as opposed to what it was, a massacre, is shifting blame somehow to those who were there to defend democracy. That's just making stuff up. Now, this is one example of making stuff up that's tied to this larger, the bigger lie, the biggest lie of all that we're dealing with American history in the 20th century has to deal with the lost cause. And this is very much wrapped up into the Reconstruction aspect of that. So we just make stuff up. The second thing that we do, rather than confronting this history directly, is we try to rationalize it away. We rationalize the evil. And here we see it in that second sentence when they say that this event marked the end of carpetbag misrule. In other words, this political violence was necessary. Murdering, slaughtering 150 African-American men was necessary in order to stop political corruption during the Reconstruction era. Because in the minds of those who would trumpet white supremacy, political corruption during the Reconstruction era warranted and necessitated ending Reconstruction. And so whatever needed to be done to do that was acceptable. In this telling of the past, those who are the ones who do the killing are somehow reframed as the defenders of democracy, rationalizing evil. So when we think about what the following year, on the anniversary of January 6th, when President Biden gives a very powerful, arguably his most powerful speech as president, where he talks explicitly about what's at stake. And I'm sitting there, again, watching TV, because apparently I watch too much TV, and I'm watching TV, and I'm nodding my head, and he's going along, and he's going along. And then he says, you know, this political violence, you know, we can't accept it, we can't tolerate it, and I'm nodding my head. And then he says, because this is not who we are. And I'm like, really? This may not be who we want to be, but when you look at the past, when you look at American history, this is exactly who we are. And at a certain point, we have to take an honest look at in the mirror, and say, you know what? This is our history. James Baldwin, you can never go wrong when you read or you listen or you watch James Baldwin. James Baldwin said, we are our history. We are our history. That includes the good and the bad. This history of political violence justified by racism in order to maintain white supremacist political power is our history. And we have to accept that. We have to acknowledge that. That's critically important, especially when we're talking about democracy. And how do we not just preserve and protect it, but how do we extend and expand it? So what is this history? We are this history. Because there's a lot of history talk going on these days. And when we think about our history, we have to start in the beginning. And right now, all this conversation around 1619, all these good white folk losing their minds over a date. 1619, don't know what to do with a date. A date. A date. Brother Shelton, that's like practice. We talk about practice. We talk about a date. Why are you losing your mind over a date? 1619, the year in which 20 and odd Africans, 29 Negroes, as they were listed on the manifest, are brought in chains and sold to white colonists in Virginia. a date. That's what happens in 1619. Why are you losing your mind over a date? Because of what that date represents and what we don't want to acknowledge. That date represents a choice that will be made in colonial America to embrace slavery. And not just as something that's done on the side, but what 1619, this moment, this decision that is made to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. And why this, we can't ignore it, is because what is established at that moment is the intersection of what will become the twin pillars of American society. And that is the intersection of racism and capitalism. When we talk about America's DNA and imagining that double helix, the two strands of that are racism and capitalism. Racism and capitalism combined will give us slavery for 250 years. Racism and capitalism combined will give us 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. Racism and capitalism will give us 50 years of mass incarceration. And the war on drugs, you cannot separate the two. So we're losing our mind over a date. You want to talk about practice, you don't want to talk about the game. You don't want to talk about what's really happening. So you want to play, folk want to play a date game, calendar game. I'm like, okay, we can play a calendar game. You don't want to deal with 1619. You want to talk about 1776. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about 1776. So, of course, in September, the former 2020, former president of the United States issues this 1776 commission, right? You got to have patriotic history. Now, this is really important, actually. Not that Donald Trump read anything that was in it, but that this actually serves, and we'll circle back to this in a little bit, what is contained in this executive order actually serves as the blueprint for all of the divisive issues, measures, anti-critical race theory laws that will begin to be passed in state legislatures in the following year. So there's actually, we can't ignore it and dismiss it. But we do need to take up 1776. Right? We the people, right? All men are created equal. And I have these, people want to debate and talk about, well, we shouldn't be talking about 1619, we should be talking about 1776. I'm like, okay, let's talk about 1776. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. Please, by all means, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. You want to talk about race and democracy? All men are created equal? There was no need for a qualifier for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is one of the first people who's trying to scientifically explain racism and white supremacy. Thomas Jefferson. The same Thomas Jefferson who was raping a 14-year-old girl who he claims ownership over, and Sally Hemings. So, yeah, we could talk about Thomas Jefferson. But we don't want to talk about that. Just like, all right, you don't want to talk about Thomas Jefferson? You don't want to talk about that? And folk will point to, and this is why you got to connect the past to the present. And people love talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, right? Not the complex, radical Dr. King. They got Dr. King frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial dreaming. And they'll say, well, Dr. King in that famous speech, as though he only had one speech, like Dr. King in that famous speech talks about the promise of the Declaration of Independence. How can you say the Declaration of Independence isn't what it is? And they say, what are you talking about? Yeah, Dr. King in 1963 is like, hey, look at the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Yeah, he says that. But he's under no illusions that that's not what Jefferson meant. He was clear, just as Jefferson is clear. And there's a long tradition of oppressed people, of black folk in America, looking and using the words of the oppressor. David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Ida B. Wells. That's like the game we used to, growing up in New York, we didn't have working class family. I thought I was middle class, but I wasn't. I was working class only because my parents worked, but that wasn't much. And we used to play a game, no takebacks, right? You say, you said something, no takeback. That's what Dr. King was saying. He was like, look, you said it. Can't take it back. I know you didn't mean it, but we're going to insert this new meaning. We're going to interpret it and make it more expansive. But that doesn't change the history. That doesn't change the history. That's just applying it in a new way. But this isn't just, we have this history knowledge gap. Right? Well, folk can't separate the Declaration of Independence from the Constitution. It's like, all right, well, maybe that was the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution, clearly when it comes to democracy in America, right? We the people, right? This is the promise of America. And I'm like, yeah, let's talk about the Constitution. Because you can't talk about the Constitution without talking about the father and the architect of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, who was James Madison. Over the last couple of years, a couple of years before the pandemic hit, and thankfully I was able to start it up again last fall, I've had the great pleasure of taking small groups of students to James Madison's plantation estate, Montpelier. This is where James Madison was born. This is where he grew up. This is where he retired after his presidency. This is where he died. This is his home. James Madison, fourth president of the United States, architect of the Constitution, father of the Bill of Rights. And literally, this is the site, the place, the room right above, in between those two columns, right above that middle door, is the room where he conceives and conceptualizes the Bill of Rights. Where place matters, history matters. This is where history is happening. And so when I take my students from Ohio State and we go to James Madison's plantation home, slave labor camp home, the first place we go is we go to that library. And I say, this is where history happened. This is where that document, right, that preserves our rights as citizens, protects us from government overreach, conceived and conceptualized. But then after we spend a little time there, the very next place that I take them is down to the cellars of Montpelier. Because James Madison wasn't just the fourth president of the United States. James Madison was also an enslaver. James Madison enslaved over 100 people over the course of his lifetime and never freed a single soul, not even upon his death. The only way, if you were held in bondage to James Madison, that you were able to live free or be free is if you died or leave that plantation space, was if you died, you ran away, or he sold you. That was it. And so after we spent a little time in that library, I said, come downstairs to the basement, because this is the space that the enslaved folk who managed that house, who managed his household, who managed his affairs, this is where they spent most of their time. But when you go down there, you can do something. You can place your hands on the brick walls of this plantation home. And when you do that, and you run your hand along those walls, invariably you will feel these indentations, you will feel these ridges in the brick, on the face of the brick. And when you do that, you will soon realize, after you look at that, and you can see it in that middle, the larger black brick, that indentation, that's actually a fingerprint, a handprint of the people who made the bricks. But when you put your hand on that brick, you realize that it's too small to be a handprint of an adult, because it's the handprint of a child. Because all of the bricks at Madison's plantation were made by the children that he enslaved. That was their job. That was their task. That was their assignment, to make bricks for his comfort and convenience. And this was common practice. Mount Vernon for Washington, Monticello for Jefferson. So if you want to talk about the Constitution, we have to talk about James Madison in the context of who he was. He is an enslaver, someone who is conceiving and conceptualizing the Bill of Rights, yes, by pulling volumes from about the great Greek philosophers and Enlightenment thinkers out of his 4,000 volume personal library, one of the largest collections in colonial America at the time. But all he had to do was look out of his window and look at the people that he was holding in bondage to clearly identify those basic rights that he did not want government to infringe upon. Everything that he lists in those first 10 amendments are rights that he is denying people himself. He didn't have to read a book to understand the importance of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, due process, because he was denying it to the people he was holding in bondage. And then we try to rationalize this away. It's like, well, this really wasn't what he was about, though. You know, it was just an economic system. It was just a job. Just like he was an Uber driver, right? Like this wasn't no side hustle. James Madison was a third-generation enslaver. Third generation. His grandfather before him, his father, and then him. 3 generations of Madisons hold 6 generations of African people in bondage. 6 generations. That's what they did. And this is so important because this is the beginning. And we're embedding in law what this democracy could be, should be, and would be at that particular moment in time. But it doesn't stop there, right? So this is the beginning. This is how we're starting it. These are the people and what they're thinking. They're trying to preserve white supremacy in law. But then, you know, one of the great myths of sort of American history is the myth of perpetual racial progress. Perpetual racial progress. This idea that, yeah, things may have been bad once, but they always get better. There was slavery, but, you know, we had the Civil War, so we ended it. Then there's this period of Jim Crow, which we really don't understand and talk about in the classroom, but you got Martin Luther King. And then after Martin Luther King, you got Barack Obama and Beyonce, so it's all good. Perpetual progress, right? But that's not the way history unfolds. That's not the way democracy has grown. And so when we look at a particular moment in time, even after Reconstruction, to the turn of the 20th century, between 1890 and 1910, every state in the former Confederacy rewrote their state constitutions for the sole purpose of taking the vote away from African Americans. Every state. And they have to do it in a way that does not acknowledge or recognize race because of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. And so this is colorblind language that they're using. And when you look at and you go back and you read the convention notes and the convention debates, you have the white elite debating among themselves. They're like, look, if we do this, these are the rich white folk. They're like, if we do this, we are going to disenfranchise some of these poor white folk. And then you have others who are like, you know, that's all right. Everybody got to make sacrifices. White solidarity. But willing to throw overboard those whites of less means in order to maintain a white supremacist supporting government. There's a cost. When you limit democracy targeted at African Americans, white folk will suffer. They act like they don't, but history tells us that they do. And so this isn't perpetual progress. This is going backward. After that moment of possibility during Reconstruction, this is when things get worse. This is the period when we have racial terrorism reaching its height. Now, eventually we will have the civil rights revolution, but before we even get there, we're not just talking about a change in laws. The reason why these laws are so effective is because of the threat and use of violence. During that same period, between 1890 and 1910, And it extends another 2 decades during the height of lynching between 1890 and 1930. On average, 2 African Americans are murdered publicly every week for almost 40 years. Murdered publicly without consequence, not by roving gangs of hooded men, but by people who did not need to wear a mask because there was no penalty. Now, we have to put that into context too. So you're talking about 100 or so African Americans murdered every year publicly for a period of 30 years. Well, over the last 15 years, from 2005 up until the present, police in the United States have killed 3 times as many as of that number every year as well. 3 times as many African Americans die at the hands of the police today than died at the hands of lynch mobs during the height of lynching. That's a different form of terror, but it's still terror. So how do things change in that context? How are we able to actually expand democracy? Because things do get better. We got to deal with progress. But it just doesn't happen. There is a revolution, and that's the civil rights revolution. And that is what it is. That is what happens. When we're talking about transforming the democracy, expanding the democracy, extending the right to vote to African Americans, allowing women, not just black women, but all women, white women as well, to participate and sit on juries in the state of Alabama and the like. This was a revolution. And it gets codified in 1965, thinking about the politics of it with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But because when we look at American history, we're not talking about perpetual progress. When you have a revolution, inevitably there's a counter-revolution. And we see that. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, now as I look around here, I'm glad that you all remember Ronald Reagan too. Ronald Reagan launches his bid for president of the United States. Ronald Reagan, of course, governor of California. He announces it not in California, not in New York City, not in Washington, D.C., but in Neshoba County, Mississippi. There ain't nothing in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Why on earth is he announcing his run for president of the United States in Neshoba County, Mississippi? That's because 16 years earlier, in 1964, 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And in his announcement, he's not going down there saying, and we will find justice for those victims. He's down there signaling that those who were upset by the expansion of basic political rights, basic civil rights, and human rights to African Americans, that they now have a home within the Republican Party. Now, when I try to explain this to my students at The Ohio State University, they had that cognitive dissonance. They're like, well, this doesn't make any sense, Dr. Jeffries. I asked one student, I said, well, why do you think he would announce it in Neshoba County, Mississippi? And the student, he looked confused and perplexed. He said, well, maybe he didn't know what happened. As though he was on his campaign bus and it just happened to break down in Neshoba County, Mississippi. He's like, well, this is as good a place as any. After that, now this is the beginning of class. By the end of class, he was better prepared. But for some, it's willful ignorance. Like, we don't want to have to deal with that reality of what is he doing? What is Reagan doing here? Reagan understands, like Nixon understood before him, like Donald Trump understands, that racism is the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created. Period. And it worked. It worked for Nixon. It worked for Reagan. It worked for Donald Trump. This was the counter-revolution. And after the 65 Voting Rights Act is passed, we will see consistent efforts to undermine it. consistent efforts. Now, you have conservatives who are signing off on it, right? Reauthorization. But at the same time as they're doing that, even during the Reagan government, he has his attorney general targeting black elected officials in Alabama, going after them. So you get the voting rights bill, and it's constantly under assault. And then, of course, fast forward to 2013, the Roberts Court in Shelby versus Holder essentially gutting the Voting Rights Act, taking the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act, saying that the formula used that triggered Justice Department oversight was outdated and therefore could no longer be applied. So no state had to get pre-clearance, had to clear their new voting rights legislation with the Justice Department. That opens the floodgates. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has since passed on, this will probably live on as her most important, most famous dissent, in which she's saying to us that the argument that, well, you no longer have the same kinds of efforts to suppress the vote to keep all black folk from voting, so therefore you don't need these protections. She says that's ridiculous. Discriminatory changes is like stopping discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. She's saying they were working. And rather than contracting or getting rid of them, we should have been expanding them. Like, yeah, keep them on Georgia, keep them on Alabama, but you need them on Ohio too. When you understand what the state legislature has been doing over the last few years. So those are the floodgates. You open the floodgates, you're going to get the flood. And we see the flood in January of 2021, when the state legislature in Georgia begins to pass a wave of voter suppression measures, laws designed to make it more difficult for people to vote. I don't care what side of the political spectrum that you are on. If you are doing things to make it harder for people to vote, that is fundamentally anti-democratic. And we should not be surprised by this flood of new laws that we're seeing passed because you open the floodgates. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, remove the umbrella, you're going to get wet. Now we're drowning. And this is fundamentally anti-democratic. But it's also part of that long tradition. And so we have the flood, but then how do we rationalize it? And this is where the foolishness comes in. All this hysteria around critical race theory. All critical race theory is, and I'll wrap up in a second, all critical race theory is saying is that you got to take the role of race and racism seriously in American society. That if you want to talk about James Madison, you can't talk about James Madison without talking about those bricks. If you want to talk about the Declaration of Independence, you can't talk about the Declaration of Independence without explaining why there is no need in the mind of Jefferson for a qualifier of race. That's what we're saying. Take it seriously. But you got folk running around here like, oh, I don't, we can't talk about that. That's upsetting little Kylie. She gonna be all right. You know what's upsetting? Not talking about making bricks. What's upsetting is actually having to make those bricks. Like, that's upsetting. That's what hurts. That's the harm. A lot of times we talk about the danger of repeating history. History is a cycle. If you don't know history, then you're doomed to repeat it. That's actually giving us too much credit for having stopped doing something in the past. And now we're worried about doing it again. We never stopped. I'm less worried about repeating the past and more worried about disrupting that continuum. Stop doing the things that we have been doing that continue to perpetuate inequality. That's the disruption that we need. And we're in the midst of a moment in which we're seeing the potential to do that. So just in 2020, in the midst of this pandemic, we saw the largest protests in American history. In June of 2020, some 20 to 30 million people, Americans, take to the streets demanding justice for the victims of police violence, demanding a recognition of black humanity, demanding an honest telling of the past. That's why these young people in particular were saying you got to take down these monuments to white supremacy, and also calling for an end to systemic racism. And that last piece, that's what really shook political conservatives up, because that was the most dangerous aspect. Because you can deal with justice for the victims of police violence. You can sacrifice 1 or 2 police officers. You were sacrificing hundreds of thousands of white folk in order to keep African Americans from voting. You'll throw a white police officer in the jail. But when you start talking about ending systemic racism, you're talking about changing systems and structures. And the only way to respond to that demand is to actually do something. And the only way to keep from doing something is to delegitimize what the call is. And that's where you get folks saying, oh, this critical race theory hysteria. We ought not be talking about it. Because if you can delegitimize what systemic racism actually is, the source and the problems, then you don't have to do anything about it. But the way you create change is by doing something, is by acting. Dr. King famously said, and would often quote St. Augustine by saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And sometimes we get a little bit too comfortable with that. We say, oh, well, if the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, then therefore we can just wait for justice to occur, if that's its natural inclination. But the other piece to that, which Dr. King talks about in his letter from Birmingham jail, why it's so important to read that, he says, yeah, it will bend towards justice if you have people willing to exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. He said, in its absence, just sitting and waiting for time to pass, that's not going to do anything. Time is not a social force capable of creating change. It's just a unit of measure. And so you have to exert the force. And that's what these young people were doing, mostly young folk. I tried to get out there. Then I had to go back home. But the young folk were out there. They were willing to act. And we need to do what we can do in our positions of authority and power to support their work. They are willing to act. They have the energy. We just have to create the context and give them the support and do what we can do so that we, in fact, are part of the group of people willing to bend that arc toward justice. Well, thank you very much.
We certainly thank Dr. Jeffries for just a stirring presentation, and we want to provide an opportunity for those of you who have questions for a few more minutes while we're here. There are microphones on both sides, and we ask you to go ahead and approach those microphones if you would like to pose a question. I'll get it started a little bit. But you know, I'll get out of the way. I don't need to necessarily marshal that process. But I will start with this one quick question. And you talked about disrupting, and you mentioned some of the things that the young people were doing. I would like to hear maybe some insights on what are some concrete things that we might be able to do in order to disrupt this continuum of what's going on now. And then I will let you to marshal your questions accordingly to these brilliant people who have stood up.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for the question. You know, it depends on what area of life that we're talking about, right? I mean, if we're talking about housing insecurity, right? How are we going to talk about sort of issues of affordable housing? How do we raise these issues, right? I mean, if we're talking about electoral politics, you know, what can we do to make sure that the franchise is protected, that people can get to the polls, right? I mean, so there's big picture things that we can do, but even on the individual level, it's like, how do we get involved in those questions with those issues, right? I mean, so I think the first question is, well, where's the area of interest? Because it's all interconnected. But then within that, well, how can I interject myself. Now, sometimes it is, sort of raising a voice in the streets. But a lot of times, that takes a lot of energy. But then what do you do after that? What do you do after you have the attention? How do you keep the pressure on elected officials? But then, even most simply, things that we can do, ourselves on a daily basis is what kind of conversations are you having with the people in your circle? Right? What truths are you what questions are you willing to ask? What are you willing to admit that you got wrong in the past and are now learning from? And so I think the answer to that is, there's something that we can do every day, certainly in our conversation, in our teaching, in an academic institution, having these conversations, carrying those out, but then thinking about what these problems are, then how can I be a part of raising the awareness and then sort of engaging so that people can have access to the things that all of us deserve. Hey, we'll come over here and then we'll do one and one.
Thank you so much. Let me see.
It's on.
Is it on? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for your presentation, your conversation, your voice in this space. The first thing I want to say, so I teach at the law school. So let me preface my comment with that. You in your Colfax massacre example, you said they make things up. I struggle with critical race theory and our continued sort of use of that phrase to talk about the truth of American history. I would count that label as one of the things that they make up. So I just have to say that out loud. The other thing that I wanted to maybe to have you speak about just a little bit is what maybe I'll call the schizophrenic duality of the federal government right now. And of course, that has been true, right, since the beginning. But looking at this particular slide, I think about the young people who were out after George Floyd's the killing of Breonna Taylor, right? The speculation around what happened to Ahmaud Arbery in the summer of 2020. And I just know and understand very clearly that as much as the federal government has said that they stand with Black people through the passage of the 13th, 14th, 15th, right, like the amendments, and the activists who really want to see police change. We also know that the federal government is doing things like prosecuting demonstrators for things, right, that normally local governments would only pursue. And I wonder if you could speak to sort of what signals we should be looking to from our history to help us to understand where we're likely to head moving forward. Is that too much?
No. Okay. No, that's great. That's great. We have at least another hour. I think one, when thinking about the federal government, of course, and you understand this, but just for clarity, it's important to look at the three branches, right? Because they don't always work together. They're not always working in harmony. So we see moments in time where different branches are working in support of advancing African American, so civil and human rights. Never voluntarily, always being forced, always being pushed, right? Often very hesitant. But there are these moments. You mentioned the Reconstruction Amendments. There you have sort of a legislative push, but the executive branch with Andrew Johnson is adamantly against, right? The Supreme Court. Like, a lot of times when we think about the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court, we get fixated on Brown and be like champions of civil rights. That's one case, right? I mean, you look at the longer history, whether you're talking about Dred Scott or Plessy versus Ferguson, or even more recently, when you're looking at Shelby versus Holder, the longer history is actually making it more difficult for full participation of African Americans. So I think when we look at the executive branch, we like to think, oh, John F. Kennedy, Camelot, they were these heroes. Hey, him and Bobby got dragged kicking and screaming into the movement. Right? And as soon as Dr. King came out against the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson was like, we're done. Right? I mean, so the much longer history, when we think about sort of federal involvement and support for basic civil rights and human rights for African Americans, has actually been not supportive. And so when we move into these moments, again, we shouldn't be surprised. But it's important that we raise that awareness and say, wait a minute, this is patently unfair. Right? And we have to continue to call it out when we see it. And also, when you get folk in office who say that they're allies and supportive, then we got to hold them accountable. Right? I mean, when Barack Obama was in office, I remember I knew we were in trouble when I was down in Alabama. This is 2008. He's just elected to office, and I was in a community meeting, and I'm sitting there, and the brother gets to the microphone, and he's like, Barack Obama's president of the United States, and he's sent there by God. And I was like, oh, Lord have mercy. How can you critique any policies that he has? If he was sent by God, that works both ways. It's like, I can't do anything with that. So I'm not surprised that Ferguson happens on his watch. I mean, so we have to have that even with those in office who are supportive. We have to hold them probably even to a higher standard and be willing to critique them as much as anybody else who comes out vocally against these basic civil rights and human rights. So the federal government ought to be an ally, isn't always, and therefore we have to do the work to make sure that they become. Thank you. Well, one and the two.
Hi, Dr. Jeffries. My name is Nathan. I'm a student here in the Masters of Public Health program. I just wanted to say, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask a question about the Neshoba incident that you talked about earlier, because it's particularly eye-opening and jarring, and I want to make sure I understand your point on that correctly. Are you saying that Reagan announced his campaign there because of the 1964 incident itself, because of the culture that the 1964 incident suggests is sympathetic to his racist beliefs, or some combination of the two?
Yes. Exactly. Exactly. He was signaling, because the community hadn't fundamentally changed, right? I mean, 15, that ain't that long ago. And so by him going there, he's saying that those white Southerners who were still animated by racism, did not want black folk to participate in the political process, was still upset by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, by the Civil Rights Revolution, that you now have a political home. That you have a political home. And he didn't have to say anything. The fact that he's standing there, he's signaling to white Southerners, come home to this party. He was playing to white supremacy. He was playing to racism. And by going there, he's saying that that kind of racism was acceptable. And then so, you don't even have to get into his sort of, was Reagan a racist? I don't even play that game. I don't even care about the individual, what the individual is thinking. All I have to do is look at the actions. And what was he signaling in the action? And that's important, because what we're seeing now, racism, the most powerful political organizing tool, like Donald Trump didn't create that, right? The Republican Party isn't getting hijacked. They have been playing this game since 1968, when Nixon talks about the Southern strategy and Republicans start talking about law and order. And then that becomes the new Republican Party. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You're welcome to come down to Ohio State, teach my class whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffries, for what I think is very powerful, and I want to contextualize my question as well. So my PhD advisor used to say often that the data never lies. And, during the course of my PhD, I realized what he was implying, that the data doesn't lie, it's subject to interpretation. And that individuals can interpret the same piece of data in different ways, the same piece of history in different ways. So one of the things that I got out of your lecture is that history is subject to interpretation. And so going back to how do we make sense of all of this, I asked the question, how do we make sense of this when data and history is subject to interpretation?
No, that's a great question. Spoken like a true scientist. And maybe you'll get this. The data is subject to interpretation. History is subject to interpretation. We can debate and discuss and interpret 1619 and 1776. but you can't make up data. That's the thing. You can interpret it. We can interpret it differently, but you're not entitled to make up your own data sets and just throw them in there. And that's what we're doing with some of this misinterpretation, some of these false narratives. The lost cause is making up data. That's just completely fabricating stuff and then saying, well, I think we're each entitled to interpret sort of the origins of the Civil War. No, you're not. Right? Like it was to preserve the institution of slavery. Well, Reconstruction, that's debatable. No, it's not. We don't see massive waves of political corruption. That's something that was fabricated, a data set that was fabricated in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But then because we don't confront it, because we don't talk about it, because we don't teach it, then folk get into not just sort of conflicting interpretations, then they come up with these sort of false equivalencies. Well, my data is just as good as your data. No, it ain't. Like, take that to, the National Science Foundation, right? Like, no, it gets sent right back. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like, look, we got to agree on a data set before we can have the conversation about interpreting it. And right now, not just in terms of history, but even in our political discourse, one of the things that is so troubling in the moment that we're in, and in this moment is coming from the political right, is that we're no longer dealing with facts. And not only in terms of science, just in terms of looking at sort of what happened in the 2020 election. Like, there's no massive fraud. Like, that's just completely fabricated. But, and this is the danger, and particularly the danger of the moment that we're in, is that one of the things, I will debate anything with anybody, right? About the past, about politics. Even if I'm wrong, I'll debate it. One thing I do not debate, I don't debate religion. I'm a Christian, not a very good one, but still a Christian. But I don't debate religion. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, why? Because religion is belief in the absence of fact. It's faith. Subject to interpretation for sure, biblical text, but it's faith. I mean, so what can I really interject and say, I have this fact that's going to sway your opinion? I can only share an interpretation. So I don't debate religion. Our political discourse coming from the political right is now like religion. And you can't debate it because it's not based on fact. It's based on the faith of what they are hearing. That's dangerous because there's no policy discussion. I can't move you to a different position. We can't compromise on anything because they're dealing with a completely different set of data, one that is fabricated to suit their own purposes. And no amount of evidence that I share with them will move them off their position because it's not based in reality. Now, how do you solve that? How do you move forward with that? Your answer to that is as good as I want to hear. Thanks. For sure. Yes.
Wow. I was going to ask a question, but now I want to further the previous question because I signed up with an organization to volunteer this weekend to go to talk to folks about vaccine hesitancy. And so now the previous conversation lends into what I'm going to do this weekend because you heard something and you believe it, period, the end.
Yep.
And that is dangerous. And we want to keep communities as safe as possible from catching and spreading COVID and or having a bad outcome from COVID. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what am I going to say to people? Because they probably heard something, believe it, and no amount of facts, anything I provide, so I could just talk personally from myself, but what can I provide to sway them and change their mind?
Yeah.
But thank you for coming today, and I appreciate you coming to Cleveland and coming to Case.
Thank you very much. Along those lines, we know that simply sharing facts it's not enough to move people off of positions that they are deeply entrenched in. Like information in and of itself. Now, this is coming from a teacher. He's like, well, isn't that what you do? I try, right? But I also have students, hopefully, who are coming into the classroom, and I tell them on day one, like, I'm not here to change anybody's mind. All I want is for you to have an open mind. Like, that's it. But what do you do when you don't have an open mind? Simply presenting the facts is not enough. That led W.E.B. Du Bois at the turn of the 20th century, right, out of academia. He was teaching down at Atlanta University every year, rolling out sociological studies on the African-American experience to say to enlightened white America, all this white supremacy stuff doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold up to scientific inquiry. And after 10 years of that, he says, this isn't making a darn bit of difference in the minds of white folk. And he leaves academia. And he goes to the NAACP and founds as the founding editor of the Crisis magazine. Because he said, just information in and of itself is not enough. But that doesn't mean we give up, right? And so there are ways that we know, and psychologists tell us there are ways. Sharing the personal. Trying to get people to understand that, hey, you may not believe this, but by doing X, you can actually provide a benefit to the broader community. So it's those kinds of conversations, right? But you're right, if you just roll up with a fact sheet, right, whether we're talking about sort of racial inequality or we're talking about, the spread of COVID, I guarantee you that's not going to be enough because of the entrenched views that people have. And that's just hard to move them off those positions. But do go out. Okay, there we go.
I've got a yes, no, and then a longer one.
Okay.
The Colfax riot sign, is that still standing?
No. It came down within the last year. It didn't come down easily. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I was ready. I could see you had that energy. No, it didn't come down. It came down, and just a 2-minute story. People have been trying to get it removed. Once the civil rights and black power movement begins, and you have African-American desegregation finally occurs 10 years, 15 years after the Brown decision, and you have black parents moving into desegregated white schools in Louisiana, they say, hey, we got to talk about Colfax, not so much the sign, but we got to talk about the Colfax massacre. But at that point, the state of Louisiana is like, you know what, we're not going to talk about it at all. If we can't frame it as this riot, if we can't frame it as something that's going to prop up white supremacy, we're not going to talk about it at all. Same thing happens in Wilmington, North Carolina. Same thing happens in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You got kids growing up in Tulsa, never heard of the Tulsa race riot, race massacre, because it gets pulled out. So that sign there remained in place even after. And you have black people like, you got to take this thing down. And then finally, because it was actually sitting like in front of the courthouse, but it was on state property, there was a black woman who was like the Secretary of Commerce and something, and it fell under her jurisdiction, this little plot of land. And she did not need the parish commissioners, majority of whom were white and who refused to remove it. She did not need their permission. And she said, guess what? It's gone. And she took it out. And literally, this is less than a year ago. So it took a black woman. I'm telling you, if we just listen to black women, it ain't even that complicated. You know what I'm saying? We'd be in a much better place. Now, there's a second part.
Yeah, the second part. You're talking about 1776. Now, we all know, Mr. Jefferson, the flawed hero. But we're talking about, does data make a difference? But stories make a difference. So, patriots, there were people in New Jersey, men in New Jersey, who could send their enslaved black workers to serve for them and fight in the American Revolution. The enslaver kept the money, the wages, and then that enslaved person went back to being enslaved. Whereas my white ancestors, when they served in the American Revolution, they were given land and they were offered enslaved people as payment.
Yeah.
So how do people react to that kind of story about 1776?
Well, I think there's one, they don't hear that story, right? But the most common response to even, when you talk to docents, and I've done some work at Montpelier and these other places, And I asked them, I said, well, what's the most common response to you when you talk about Madison being an enslaver or Jefferson being an enslaver? The most common response is, but wasn't he a good master? But wasn't he a good master? That's the rationalization. So even if you lay this stuff out, you will still have to deal with the rationalization of the evil, right? It's like, well, you know, they needed to run the plantation and manage the farm, and they couldn't be risked the sack. I mean, that's all a rationalization. And so it's, yeah, you got to share the information, but once you do that, then you have to say, you got to be prepared for the rationalization. To say, no, there's no such thing as being a good master because of what it takes for you in order to hold somebody else in bondage. All that goodness is out the window. And in the same way, well, they didn't know any better. This was the law. They were just doing what everybody else did. That's not true either. No matter the period in American history, there are always folk, white folk, right, who are having dinner with James Madison and Dolly Madison, eating ice cream that she said she made, and you know, the slave folk downstairs in the basement who are telling them what they're doing is wrong. They know it's wrong. This is why Madison's always upset with Thomas Jefferson, because he's like, Thomas Jefferson, you won't shut up, right? Talking about, yeah, that we're really in trouble, right? Madison's trying to craft his future. Jefferson's like, I don't know, I don't think this is right. And yet he doesn't free anybody either. And so I think we can share the information, but you got to be prepared for the rationalization, because that's coming next. Because people want to deal with it. Not because the history isn't right, but because of what it says about them today. Like, this isn't about the past. This is about the present. This isn't about white people in the past. This is about white people in the present, looking back at the past and saying, what does this say about us now? What does it say about the privileges that I have inherited? And not wanting to deal with that. And the truth is, you ain't responsible. Hey, what you tripping for? Right? No white person around today, no little white girl around today, a little white boy is responsible for slavery or Jim Crow. Especially our children. People don't want to talk about it. Your children aren't responsible for the mess that we've created today, but they are responsible for tomorrow. Every single one of them is responsible for tomorrow and solving the problems. And our responsibility, certainly as educators and as parents, is to prepare them to address those issues. To say, look, you got to understand the past so you can address this stuff going forward. So you got to understand how sort of wealth was being played out in that way so that we don't replicate that going forward. But it is a challenge. And we're not going to solve it, but we certainly won't solve it if we don't engage in conversation. Thank you. You get to one more?
We'll have to close out here.
Okay, I'm going to start with just 4 words that answer the first question that came up about what we can do or what you can do. Honesty for Ohio education.
Yeah.
Google it. New organization. Mission is to address anti-honesty initiatives at our state house bills that prohibit teaching divisive concepts at our local school boards and at our state board of ed. So
Absolutely.
Please, honesty for Ohio education. On my way over here, I was reading an Ed Week article that just published a survey of supposedly representative adult Americans, and over half don't think that the ongoing effects of racism should be taught in schools. And the results of that and the advocacy behind those leanings just resonated with me as you talked about not debating religion, because the other 2 arenas that Americans feel that way about are teaching sex ed and evolution. And I thought that juxtaposition was both dangerous, even more dangerous than the proposition itself is that we shouldn't be teaching about racism. So your later comments about religion and faith made me want to ask that question.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the urgency of the moment, and isn't just a concern for African Americans. It's like, not talking about the significance of race and racism in American society, the persistence of systemic racism, isn't just going to impact the lives of African Americans. because we know the way this works. History has shown us you don't stop with the history of one group. And so we see that legislation targeting quote unquote critical race theory, talking about the black experience, the black past. But now in Florida, we're not going to talk about LGBTQ stuff, people, experiences. We're seeing it. Tennessee, same thing. Texas, school teachers, like, well, we're not sure what we can do with the Holocaust. We got to talk about both sides. There ain't no both sides. Sometimes there's just right and wrong. But we see the silence that is coming as a result of this. And it is sweeping, and it is expansive, and it is dangerous. Because while the education may not move people off positions who don't know, it will keep others from going further. And so somebody asked me, they said, where does this end? If you allow the book banning, if you allow the silencing, if you stop teaching the history of marginalization and oppression in America, where does this end? What's the last stop of that train? That last stop is Auschwitz. That's where that train ends. We know where it ends. And those are the stakes. Because this isn't about this is not just about policy, and I've been hesitant to say this, but the evidence is just there. Because we've seen these moments in the American past that we're actually not dealing with people who are honestly trying to protect democracy. They're not. They don't see democracy in America as being deserving of protection. They see democracy in America as being the problem. That's not a policy debate. When you see the principal threat to a multiracial democracy in America is white supremacy. And so those who are rallying around white supremacy because they don't want to talk about the problems in the American past, they are not trying to protect democracy. They are trying to undermine democracy. And that's not a debate. That's when your boys from Morehouse call and they're like, yo, we got you. I mean, that's literally where we're headed. And so before we get there, we have to do the things, both in conversation, but raising that sort of fierce sense of the urgency of now. Like, this isn't just, oh, it will change. Let it pass. No, once that train leaves the station, it just picks up momentum until it's stopped. And I think that's where we are. We got to figure out how to stop it. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your participation and for being here. I can't close out with thanking the incredible team at OIDIO who are doing an outstanding job. We have our new intern, Heather Willis, over there, who is helping with the microphones. The incredible Janae Johnson, who keeps us on track. Our program manager, Kimberly Springer, who, without her, these programs don't go forward. We have our director of diversity, Michael Bustamante, and certainly our senior director for faculty, Dr. Heather Burton. They are incredible, and they make it possible for to do all the things that we do. And Dr. Jeffries, we thank you so much for a sobering look at this moment and the motivation and inspiration for us to stay engaged and to stay the course so that we can impact the course of our history. So thank you all very much.